My name is Linda Rich, and I chair the Justice and Witness Missional Team of the Hawaii Conference of the United Church of Christ. We are hosting these presentations in collaboration with the Association of Hawaiian Evangelical Churches. Is Kalani Akea is he in yet? I really want to acknowledge him for bringing the idea of these presentations to the Justice and Witness Missional Team, and for using his contacts to arrange for us to have such an illustrious array of presenters. This will be 12 weeks every Sunday at 4 o'clock, same time, same place. All right, now I would like to ask Kahu Wendell Davis, who is the Papa Makua for the Association of Hawaiian Evangelical Churches, to open us with prayer.
Thank you, Linda. And once again, mahalo to everyone that to being a part of this very special day together as well. Let's pray together. E kamakulani, Heavenly Father, mahalo nui o ko apau, mahalo haane mako I o e kia kua. E ho pau me kiloha, maka inoa o Yesu. Lord, we gather together from the north, south, east, and west, from the shores of our beloved Hawaii and beyond, to also the nation and the world, God. We come together on this first of many series of just enlightenment, God. We put on the breastplate of righteousness so that we might rightly discern what is happening around us, and we choose to look rightly to you, Lord. Gather with all of us, God, wherever we may be, as we come together as Ohana, and as we also continue to give thanks for this opportunity on this va'a that we all are a part of, to learn, to explore, to discover, to travel in this next few weeks as Ohana, and continue with your guidance to be also enriched with the wonderful information and sharing and resources by our guest speakers. We thank you also, Lord, for the blessing of all those who have joined us today. And we pray this prayer with humility and, of course, the blessing that you've given us through your Son, Jesus Christ. In his name we pray. Maka inoa kamakua ke keiki ame ka ohanamilele, ame ka ko apau. Blessings upon us. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, I pray. Amen. Thank you, Linda. Mahalo. Hello, everyone.
Mahalo. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to just make a couple of comments. You know, I think that there are many of us on these screens today who have some knowledge of Hawaiian history, and we may have a lot of knowledge, or we may think that we have a lot of knowledge. One of the things that has become more and more evident to the Justice and Witness Missional Team is that there is so much more that is continually being revealed about the history here. And part of that is because of the number of speakers of Alelo Hawaii who are now able to translate more of the documents that have come from the time of the kingdom and from the time of the overthrow. So I'm guessing that there will be some things that people will hear that will be uncomfortable for some. There will be some that will be challenging and confusing for some, and there will be some things that for others are exciting and they will feel that their truth is finally being told. So what I ask during this is openness, respect for everyone, and an acknowledgement that we are called to live out a mission of justice and peace. And this is a step. Having knowledge, having facts, and hearing one another is how we do that. So thank you. And now I want to introduce Dr. Keanu Sai. I am so delighted to have you with us here this evening, Dr. Sai. Dr. Sai is a lecturer at the University of Hawaii. He received his Ph.D. and his MA degrees in political science, specializing in international relations and public law, with emphasis on the legal and political history of the Hawaiian Kingdom. Dr. Sai is also adjunct faculty at the University of Hawaii at Manoa College of Education, Graduate Division. He also served as the lead agent for the Hawaiian Kingdom in the arbitration proceedings before the Permanent Court of Arbitration at The Hague, Netherlands, from 1999 to 2001. And I think the other thing that describes him well is Patriot of the Hawaiian Kingdom.
Mahalo, Linda, and mahalo Kahuendo and Kalani for putting this all together. My family is actually part of Kamakapili Church. Uncle Henry Aarona, I also noticed Uncle Jimmy's here. And that's from my dad's side of the family, but my dad grew up going to Kamakapili, but also going to St. Patrick's. So he got double whammy on Sundays. Spent a lot of time. For myself, I'm a graduate of the Kamehameha Schools, 1982. After Kamehameha Schools, went on to a military college, New Mexico Military Institute, where I was commissioned as a second lieutenant, as an Army Reserve officer. And I received an associate's degree in pre-business. Transferred to UH, got my bachelor's in 1987, and then I went off and fulfilled my obligation or my contract with the U.S. Army. Ended up spending the majority of my time with the Hawaii Army National Guard, first of the 487 Field Artillery. After 10 years, I got out as a captain. I used to be a battery commander, Charlie Battery. So I have that military background, but also I have that Hawaiian background. Raised in Kuli'o'o Valley, the Reeves Ohana. I was raised in a valley where your neighbors were cousins and your cousins were your friends. In fact, we just had our reunion the other week in Kuli'o'o. So that was good to see all the family. So my area is law. Yeah, I'm not Hawaiian studies. I don't come at it from a cultural standpoint, but my specialty or my specialization is in international relations and law. So I have larger articles, peer review articles, publications, and so forth that speak to that issue. Many people think I'm Hawaiian studies. I don't have a degree in Hawaiian studies, whether bachelor's, master's, or Ph.D. My undergrad was in sociology, and my master's and my Ph.D., as Linda shared, is in political science. So my approach toward Hawaii's history is from a legal lens, right? Not from an anthropological lens, not from a study of people or culture, but from a legal and political standpoint. And that's why terminology is so important, so important. So this first of this series of 4 talks that I'll give on Sundays, this first presentation will focus on terminology and then applying that to Hawaii's legal and political history, okay? So why don't we go ahead and begin? All right. Okay, so the title of my presentation is The Importance of Terminology and Why the Hawaiian Kingdom Continues to Exist. And when I speak about the Hawaiian Kingdom, I'm speaking about a country, not a sovereignty group, but a country that my great-grandparents were born into in the 1880s. Now, U.S. Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia once stated, words have meaning, and their meaning doesn't change. This is an important point, especially coming from a legal standpoint, and that's where I come from. There is an academic movement that I call Hawaiian Indigeneity, whose premise is that the Hawaiian Kingdom was controlled by the United States through its American missionaries and exploited and oppressed the native people of Hawaii. On the 1848 Great Mahele, or land division, Professor Lilikala Kame'elehiva wrote, I refer to it simply as the 1848 Mahele because it proved to be such a terrible disaster for the Hawaiian people. And the word great has a connotation of superior. It was a tragic historical event, a turning point that had catastrophic negative consequences for Hawaiians. Professor John Osorio wrote that the Hawaiian Kingdom never empowered the natives to materially improve their lives, to protect or extend their cultural values, nor even in the end, to protect that government from being discarded, because the system itself was foreign and not Hawaiian. Professor Noinoi Silva concluded that the overthrow was the culmination of 70 years of US missionary presence. And Dr. Robert Stauffer, in his book, Kahana, How the Land Was Lost, wrote, the government that was overthrown in 1893 had, for much of its 50-year history, been little more than a de facto unincorporated territory of the United States, and the kingdom's government was often American-dominated, if not American-run. Well, the counter question to these conclusions would be, if the Hawaiian Kingdom was controlled by the United States, why did they have to overthrow it in 1893? You don't overthrow something that you are already in control of. Now, granted, after you overthrow it, then you can control it. Well, countering these contemporary conclusions were the officers of the Hawaiian Patriotic League, Hui Alohaina, whose majority of its membership was comprised of the Aboriginal Hawaiian commoner. In a memorial to President Grover Cleveland dated December 27, 1893, addressing the illegality of the overthrow of the government of the Hawaiian Kingdom, the officers wrote, last January, a political crime was committed, not only against the legitimate sovereign of the Hawaiian Kingdom, but also against the whole Hawaiian nation, a nation who for the past 60 years had enjoyed free and happy constitutional self-government. This was done by a coup de main of US Minister Stevens in collusion with a cabal of conspirators, mainly faithless sons of missionaries and local politicians angered by continuous political defeat, who, as a revenge for being a hopeless minority in the country, resolved to rule or ruin through foreign help. Now, that term, coup de main, is very important to note because some of these officers were legislators, but also attorneys, one in particular, Joseph Navahi, who was its president. A coup de main is a foreign invasion. A coup d'etat is an internal revolt. They were basically stating here, this was not a result of an internal revolt. This was as a result of a foreign invasion, an invasion by United States Marines. Now, Kame'elihiwa's research, her findings, she states that by 1855, the commoner class only received a total of 28,658 acres of land in fee simple, which is less than 1% of the total acreage of Hawaii, 4 million acres. Well, the actual findings are, between 1850 and 1860, the commoner class acquired 111,000 acres through the Mahele, which is in addition to the 28,000 acres. Kame'elihiwa's conclusions that the Great Mahele, or land division, oppressed the commoners is a cornerstone of the Hawaiian Indigeneity movement. Subsequent academic researchers never bothered to authenticate her research to confirm or overturn her findings. They all just duplicated her findings as the basis to push the fabricated story that the Hawaiian Kingdom, in collusion with American missionaries, oppressed the Hawaiian people. Now, in his 2002 book, Dismembering Lahui, which is another cornerstone to Hawaiian indigeneity, Professor Osorio wrote, as significant an event as the Mahele has proven to be, historians have seen it as a way of making specific indictments, either of ali'i or of colonialism. Well, 18 years later, he admitted, the Mahele was done to protect the Ho'aina, the Makainana, which is a commoner. And this was the most amazing things about the Mahele. And it was something that I didn't really understand when I wrote my book. It was something that really Professor Keanu Sai makes clear to all of us. Well, the term state, colonialism, colonization, and indigenous peoples often is used in contemporary parlance when discussing Hawaiian history. These terms have been used loosely and without true meaning and consequences by the Hawaiian indigeneity movement that only confuses the situation. Because Hawaiian history finds itself in a legal situation, it is imperative to know these terms and whether they apply or not. So let's start off with, what is an independent state? Well, it's a country defined by international law with a central government, citizenry, and borders that has exclusive authority of sovereignty over its territory. An example would be the United States. Now, just the term state, which is not being independent, is a political unit within an independent state called a federation. An example would be the state of New York that exists within the United States, being the independent state. And then we have a nation. A nation, by definition, is a group of people that has a common ancestry, language, and history. An example would be the Navajo Nation that exists within the state of New Mexico and exists within New Mexico, within the United States as an independent state. Now, the term colony is a territory attached to the state with political and economic ties. Colonization is the extension of the state's laws and policies through its citizens over territory that does not belong to another state. That's important. You can only colonize territory that is not under the territorial sovereignty of another state. And colonialism, which is the process by which colonies are established under what is called the doctrine of discovery. Now, the word indigenous, stemming from the Latin word indigenum, which is native, is produced, growing, living, or occurring natively or naturally in a particular region or environment. A native species is indigenous to a given region or ecosystem if its presence in that region is the result of only natural processes with no human intervention. This is important because human intervention is a determining factor for species to be indigenous. Humans are not indigenous. Now, the term Aboriginal, it's relating to a people who have been in a particular region from the earliest times. So when you have Aborigines in Australia, that is not the term for that people, but rather it only means that they were the first to arrive in that area called Australia. Aboriginal applies to people, not species. An example is the will of Bernice Powahi Bishop that established the Kamehameha schools. In there she states, I direct my trustees to invest the remainder of my estate to devote a portion of each year's income to the support and education of orphans, giving preference to Hawaiians of pure or part Aboriginal blood. What you'll see is the terminology used by Bernice Powahi in 1883, or at least the will dated in 1883, is a reflection of the terms of that time. So when she makes the statement preference to Hawaiians, she is referring to Hawaiians by nationality. Hawaiian is short for Hawaiian subject, like British is short for British subject. Now, of pure part Aboriginal blood, that's the native stock. Pure, Kanaka Maoli. Part, Hapa. From a political perspective, however, the use of the term indigenous is applied to an entity, not a human race, but to an entity originating in a particular region, such as an indigenous government, as distinguished from an imposed government from another country, or indigenous language, as distinguished from a language introduced later. When you combine indigenous with people, it is juxtaposed to a state that the indigenous people reside in, and that is a term that came into being in the 1980s. The term indigenous peoples was first introduced in the 1989 International Labor Organization Convention of number 169. These are peoples in independent nations who are regarded as indigenous on account of their descent from populations which inhabited the country or geographical region to which the country belongs at the time of conquest or colonization or the establishment of present state boundaries. In other words, indigenous peoples are nations that exist within a state, not of their own making. This distinction between indigenous peoples and the state is nuanced throughout the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that is pushed by the Hawaiian Indigeneity movement. In her 1999 book, From a Native Daughter, Professor Trask explained, some of us in the Hawaiian nationalist community believe the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples should become part of the framework within which future analyses, including legal discussions regarding our special status, should occur in Hawaii and in the United States. This ushered in academic research to be imbued with an indigenous rights discourse that applies critical race theory, colonial theory, and indigeneity. Now, mind you, there is nothing wrong with critical race theory, colonial theory, and indigeneity. It just may not be applicable with regard to the Hawaiian Kingdom. Academics have only duplicated the false findings of Kame'ilihiwa and Osorio. So, the reason why Native Hawaiians or Aboriginal Hawaiians, both pure and part, are not indigenous people because they have a state of their own, and it's the Hawaiian State. And that Hawaiian State was established when it was recognized on November 28, 1843. And when I say this state was established, I mean that the state was recognized as being independent. The state existed prior to that, but the recognition of its independence is crucial. And November 28, 1843, both Great Britain and France jointly recognized the Hawaiian Kingdom, or the Hawaiian Islands, as an independent state. And this day is a national holiday in the Hawaiian Kingdom, November 28th. This was followed by the United States President John Tyler by a letter of Secretary of State John C. Calhoun on July 6, 1844, that the president recognizes the independence of the Hawaiian government. Now, what is important is once a state is recognized, international law distinguishes between a state and its government, because the government exercises the sovereignty of the state. The government is not sovereign. The state is sovereign. That's why it's called independent and sovereign state, right? Also, because a government can be overthrown in international relations by war, which is regulated by international law. But by overthrowing the government, that did not mean the state ceased to exist. And that's precisely what you saw in the case of Iraq in 2003. Saddam Hussein's government was overthrown militarily by the United States. But that overthrow in 2003 of the Iraqi government did not mean Iraq ceased to exist as a state. You call that belligerent occupation. Hawaii as a state entered into treaties with Austria-Hungary, Belgium, Denmark, France, Germany, Great Britain, Italy, Japan, Netherlands, Portugal, Russia, Spain, Sweden and Norway, Switzerland, and the United States. United States, for the Hawaiian Kingdom, we had an embassy in Washington, D.C., and consulates in New York, San Francisco, Philadelphia, San Diego, Boston, Portland, Port Townsend, and Seattle. The United States also had an embassy in Honolulu. By 1893, the Hawaiian Kingdom maintained over 90 legations or embassies and consulates worldwide. The Hawaiian Kingdom was one of only 44 independent states in the 19th century. Today, we have 197. The Hawaiian Kingdom was a recognized neutral state by treaty, along with Belgium, Luxembourg, and Switzerland. The Hawaiian Kingdom's literacy was second to Scotland, and Aboriginal Hawaiians throughout the islands receive universal health care at no charge. Also, the Hawaiian Kingdom colonized the Northwest Islands of this chain of islands under the doctrine of discovery. There were no people on it except for birds and seals, but they colonized it because of their search for guano. So here we have a map of the Hawaiian Kingdom, and these are the 8 major islands, but to the northwest, those islands were acquired by discovery. And some people may say, well, Hawaii is a small country. Well, in Europe, you have a country called Luxembourg, okay? Borders Belgium, Germany, and France. Luxembourg is actually the size of Oahu, just to give some context here. The nationality or citizenry of the Hawaiian Kingdom, called Hawaiian subjects, was multi-ethnic, and that is important. It was just not comprised of Aboriginal Hawaiians, but multi-ethnic. According to the 1890 Government Census, Hawaiian subjects as a total numbered 48,107. 40,000 were Aboriginal Hawaiians, pure part. Portuguese followed by 4,000, Chinese and Japanese 1,700, other white foreigners 1,600, and other nationalities 60. Now, the resident alien population encompassed 41,000 in total, which comprised of Americans, which was only 1,900. That's less than 2% of the entire population in the Hawaiian Kingdom. Chinese at 15,000, Japanese 12,000, Portuguese 8,000, British 1,300, German 1,000, French 70, Norwegians 227, and Polynesians 588, and other nationalities at 419. Clearly, this government census clearly evidences that the population in Hawaii was not only multi-ethnic, but also the national population, of which the Aboriginal Hawaiians were the majority. The Hawaiian Kingdom was a very progressive, secular constitutional monarchy since 1852, and that's important. It was a secular system. Okay? Now, key provisions in the Hawaiian Constitution, Article 2, with regard to a secular form of government, states all men are free to worship God according to the dictates of their own consciences. Article 11, involuntary servitude, except for crime, is forever prohibited in the kingdom. Whenever a slave shall enter Hawaiian territory, he shall be free. Article 13, the monarch conducts government for the common good and not for the profit, honor, or private interests of any one man, family, or class of men among its subjects. And I especially like Article 25. No person shall ever sit upon the throne who has been convicted of an infamous crime or who is insane or an idiot. Maybe other countries might want to think about inserting that provision in their constitution. Aboriginal Hawaiians are not an indigenous people, but rather comprise the majority of Hawaiian subjects. On November 8, 1999, international arbitral proceedings were instituted at the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague, Netherlands, Larsen versus the Hawaiian Kingdom. In its 2000 arbitral award, the tribunal stated, which affirmed what I just shared with you about Hawaii being an independent state. In the 19th century, the Hawaiian Kingdom existed as an independent state, recognized as such by the United States, Great Britain, and various other states. And this is the Permanent Court of Arbitration's website, which anybody can go to. And under cases, it has Larsen versus the Hawaiian Kingdom. It states here, Lance Paul Larsen, a resident of Hawaii, brought a claim against the Hawaiian Kingdom by its Council of Regency on the grounds that the government of the Hawaiian Kingdom is in continued violation of its treaty with the United States, the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties of 1969, and the principles of international comity for allowing the unlawful imposition of American municipal laws or domestic laws over Lance Larsen within the territorial jurisdiction of the Hawaiian Kingdom. Now, clearly, this explanation of the case that took place, which is this is a world court, it accepts the fact that the Hawaiian Kingdom still exists and that there's a dispute on the imposition of American law. When they identified the parties in these proceedings, they identified Lance Larsen as a private entity, but more importantly, and why Aboriginal Hawaiians are not indigenous people, they identified the Hawaiian Kingdom as a state. That state embodies Aboriginal Hawaiians as the majority of the national population. Now, according to Professor Lenzerini, who serves on the International Law Association's Committee on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, very respectable international organization. He states indigenous peoples have an international legal right to negotiate within their state, implying that indigenous peoples are not states of their own, but reside and are entitled to exercise their rights within an existing state. This characterization does not apply to Native Hawaiians as citizens of the Hawaiian Kingdom, who rather claim to be a national people under foreign occupation. Now, other Polynesians that are not indigenous people include Samoa, which acquired its independence as a state in 1962 and joined the United Nations as a member in 1976. Tongans, they became a state on June 4th, 1970, and joined the United Nations in 1999. And Tuvalu became an independent state in 1978, and it became a member of the United Nations in the year 2000. The Hawaiian Kingdom, along with these three, and by the way, we predate these three, became an independent state on November 28, 1843. but we are not a member of the United Nations. State of war between the Hawaiian Kingdom and the United States. Judge Greenwood from the International Court of Justice states, traditional international law was based upon a rigid distinction between the state of peace and the state of war. Countries were either in a state of peace or a state of war. There was no middle ground. Acts of war trigger state of war. And a state of war includes belligerent occupation. By direction of Queen Liliuokalani, President Cleveland in March of 1893 initiated the investigation of the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom government on January 17, 1893. On December 18, 11 months later, the president reported to the Congress his findings and conclusions of the investigation. He told the Congress that on the 16th day of January, 1893, between 4 and 5 o'clock in the afternoon, a detachment of Marines from the United States steamer Boston with 2 pieces of artillery landed at Honolulu. The men, upwards of 160 in all, were supplied with double cartridge belts filled with ammunition and with haversacks and canteens, and were accompanied by a hospital corps with stretchers and medical supplies. He concluded that this military demonstration upon the soil of Honolulu was of itself an act of war. He also concluded that by an act of war, with the participation of a diplomatic representative of the United States and without authority of Congress, the government of a feeble but friendly and confiding people has been overthrown. He also concluded that the provisional government owes its existence to an armed invasion by the United States, even though they were pretending to be a real government. These acts of war committed by the United States triggered a state of war with the Hawaiian Kingdom. Under international law, the military overthrow of a country's government does not equate to an overthrow of a country called a state. According to Judge Crawford from the International Court of Justice, who recently passed away, there is a presumption that the state continues to exist with its rights and obligations despite a period in which there is no effective government. Belligerent occupation does not affect the continuity of the state, even when there exists no government claiming to represent the occupied state. Here we have state sovereignty of the Hawaiian Kingdom recognized in 1843. The government of the Hawaiian Kingdom exercised that sovereignty. That government was illegally overthrown in 1893 by the United States, admitted illegally. But the Hawaiian state would continue to exist, and that is important. According to Professor Brownlee, after the defeat of Nazi Germany in the Second World War, the 4 major Allied powers assumed supreme power in Germany. The legal competence of the German state, its independence and sovereignty, did not, however, disappear. What occurred is akin to legal representation or agency of necessity. The German state continued to exist, and indeed, the legal basis of the occupation depended on its existence. Customary international law in 1893 obligated the United States as the occupier to administer the laws of the Hawaiian Kingdom and not the laws of the United States when they are in effective control of their territory. No different than what they did in post-World War II, well, post-surrender of Nazi Germany, or destroying the Iraqi government in 2003. They administered the laws of the occupied state. They did not, the United States did not impose American law. This obligation is now codified under Article 43 of the 1907 Hague Regulations and Article 64 of the 1949 Fourth Geneva Convention. The US did not administer Hawaiian Kingdom law, and instead unilaterally seized the Hawaiian Islands during the Spanish-American War in 1898 to serve as a military outpost to protect the west coast of the United States. How does a state acquire the territory of another state under international law in the 19th century? Well, according to Professor Oppenheim, cession of state territory is the transfer of sovereignty over state territory by the owner state to another state. And the only form in which a cession can be effected is an agreement embodied in a treaty between the ceding and the acquiring state. So here we have 2 sovereign states represented by their governments. One government will cede territory to another government, either during peace, a state of peace, or during a state of war. Here's the United States. The majority of its territory was acquired through cession. cession of foreign territory by other countries. The first to have taken place was in 1803, also called the Louisiana Purchase. This was followed by Spain in 1819, the British in 1846, in 1867, the Russians with regard to Alaska. These ceded lands were done during a state of peace, but all territory north of the Rio Grande was acquired by the United States as a result of a state of war, the 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So what is the authority of Hawaii cession? Joint resolution to provide for annexing the Hawaiian Islands to the United States. Well, a joint resolution is an agreement between the House and the Senate in the Congress. It's a municipal law of the United States. It's not a treaty, it's an American law. Now, in the congressional records, Senator William Allen, in a debate with regard to the joint resolution of annexation, along with others like Senator Pettigrew, Representative Thomas Ball from Texas, they all stated that you cannot annex a foreign country by passing a law. In particular, Senator Allen stated the Constitution and the statutes are territorial in their operation. That is, they cannot have any binding force or operation beyond the territorial limits of the government in which they are promulgated. In other words, the Constitution, the US Constitution, and statutes cannot reach across the territorial boundaries of the United States into the territorial domain of another government and affect that government or persons or property. He later stated that this joint resolution annexing Hawaii is ipso facto null and void. The United States could no more annex the Hawaiian Kingdom or the Hawaiian Islands by passing a law than it can pass a law annexing Canadian territory. Well, nevertheless, in order to secure Hawaii as a military outpost, the Congress 2 years later changed the name of the Hawaiian Kingdom government apparatus to be the Territory of Hawaii. In 1959, the Congress changed the name from the Territory of Hawaii to the State of Hawaii. And then in 1993, the United States Congress passed a joint resolution apologizing for the overthrow. Now, this joint resolution is riddled with misinformation. And I encourage you to go back when you have a chance to read that joint resolution in light of the fact that you just saw this presentation that distinguishes between state, indigeneity, colonization, and so forth. Now, the United States Supreme Court in 1936 clearly stated the limitation of US law. Neither the federal constitution nor the congressional laws passed in pursuance of it have any force in foreign territory, and operations of the nation in such territory must be governed by treaties, international understandings and compacts, and the principles of international law. This is what I bring into the equation as a political scientist. In 1988, the United States Department of Justice's Office of Legal Counsel questions Hawaii's annexation. In one of its legal opinions to the US State Department, it concluded, it is unclear which constitutional power Congress exercised when it acquired Hawaii by joint resolution. Accordingly, it is doubtful that the acquisition of Hawaii can serve as an appropriate precedent for a congressional assertion of sovereignty over an extended territorial sea. As Donald James Will, also known as Dresden James, a British novelist, once wrote, when a well-packaged web of lies has been sold gradually to the masses over generations, the truth will seem utterly preposterous and its speaker a raving lunatic. What I want to share here are the Queen's own words. Let us go back to that time of this upheaval and this dilemma that was facing our kupuna, my great-grandparents, the country, the Hawaiian Kingdom. And did you know that throughout the newspapers throughout Hawaii, they were portraying Queen Liliuokalani as a monkey, and they were referring to natives as monkeys. It was really bad. Racism was crazy, right? But that is an American problem that Hawaii got thrown into. That was not in the Hawaiian Kingdom. Well, all these things happening to protect the country, the Queen's steps, methodical and legal steps, along with her supporters, Joseph Navahi, James Kaulia, right? David Kalaukalani, and others. They preserved the Hawaiian Kingdom as a state. They preserved the sovereignty under international law, but they could not hold back the unbridled power of the United States military when they seized Hawaii physically during the Spanish-American War. In her 1898 autobiography, Hawaii's Story by Hawaii's Queen, she ended her book with, "O honest Americans, as Christians, hear me for my downtrodden people. Their form of government is as dear to them as yours is precious to you. Quite as warmly as you love your country, so they love theirs. With all your goodly possessions, covering a territory so immense that there yet remain parts unexplored, possessing islands that, although near at hand, had to be neutral ground in time of war. Do not covet the vineyard of Naboths, so far from your shores, lest the punishment of Ahab fall upon you, if not in your day, in that of your children. For be not deceived, God is not mocked." So let me bring to a close my presentation with some statements, closing statements. Number one, Aboriginal Hawaiians are not an indigenous people that reside within the United States. Aboriginal Hawaiians constitute the majority of Hawaiian subjects, which is multi-ethnic. The United States never colonized the Hawaiian Islands because you can't colonize another independent state. And the Hawaiian Kingdom has been under a belligerent occupation by the United States since January 17th, 1893. With that, that concludes my presentation for the first part of this 4-part series. And turn it back over to Linda or whoever, and I'll open up for question and answers.
Mahalo, Dr. Sai, for that presentation. 1 second here. Oh, thank you, Kristen.
Oh, Cassie, I'm sorry. I thought it was Linda.
No problem. No problem. Well, mahalo for that. I'm taking lots of notes over here. I'm trying to track with you. Well, if you have questions, I think the chat will be open. So feel free to put those in the chat and then I will get to those. But just to start, while we're waiting for some questions, I was wondering, Dr. Sai, if you could, I hear Aboriginal and Indigenous being used interchangeably a lot just in the day-to-day language. Like, what are some of the impacts of that in just like how we're talking about things? Sure.
So the term, so there's nothing wrong with the word indigenous, but it applies to species, animals, plants. And human contact is a determining factor on whether or not a species is indigenous, okay? But when you tie indigenous to peoples, it creates a political term that has a particular purpose. And the term indigenous peoples was not as a term imposed upon Native people that reside within states not of their own, like the Choctaw, the Navajo, right? The Sami, right, in Europe, or the Maori, our cousins in Aotearoa in New Zealand. It rather addresses the inequities that had taken place by the, you might say, the state and its government apparatus upon the Native people within their territory. So this move was made specifically by Native people themselves to bring it to the international level of awareness, which prompted the International Labor Organization to insert it specifically in its treaty. And that eventually led to the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Rights, where Indigenous people have a voice to explain or share the problems that are taking place in their country, right? Which eventually led to the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Now, there's nothing wrong with the rights of Indigenous peoples and a Declaration of Indigenous Rights, no, but they don't apply to nationals of a state of their own, right? So we've been no different than when the United States invaded Iraq and began to say that the Kurds are indigenous people within Iraq. No, Kurds are part of the minority or a minority group within Iraq, the Shia and the Sunni, okay? And those are nations. So that's something, when you look at it from an outside of the United States, you can see where they do not use the term indigenous people because it puts them in a position of control within the state and not that they are in control of the state. That's the difference. So for Hawaii, that term indigenous has been promoted, and the Apology Resolution of 1993 just reinforced that false narrative. that Native Hawaiians are the indigenous people within the United States. No, if the Hawaiian Kingdom, or not if, because the Hawaiian Kingdom continues to exist as a state, then it's not part of the United States. Therefore, you Native Hawaiians cannot be indigenous peoples. So it's really coming at it from a legal and political standpoint, and by definition, not that I'm taking a position, right? So this is merely an analysis that allows us and the audience that I'm sharing this information with, and the students that I teach, to make informed decisions. That's really all it is. But to say Native Hawaiians are indigenous people, and they keep saying it, it doesn't mean they are, because they're not.
Got it. Thank you for clarifying that. Yeah, if you have questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. I know one of the closing statements you had, Dr. Sai, was the US never colonized the Hawaiian Islands. What would be maybe a more accurate phrase of what's happened here, what kind of state that we're in?
Well, these are good questions, Cassie. Okay. Now, the term colonization is the imposition of laws of a state, the colonizer, over territory that doesn't belong to another state. Okay, and that's how the Americas was colonized. And what you do is you plant a flag. Now, in order to take that into effect, you have to occupy that territory with your nationals. So colonists would be sent, let's say, to the East Coast of the Americas, the British, in order to colonize territories. And that is what you call occupation, which will lead to sovereignty. Okay. Now, when a country encroaches upon the territory of another state, that's not colonization, because you cannot impose laws in another country. That situation is called not just occupation, but more importantly, it's called belligerent occupation. It is militarily achieved, right? An invasion. So that term belligerent occupation is regulated by the laws of war. Occupation, which is colonization, is pretty much regulated back then by the colonizers themselves, which was very abusive. You know, the papal bulls, the Pope, you know, the Spanish taking over the Americas. We hear those stories, right? Colonization, though, really was not taken up as an international problem until after World War II. Well, yeah, World War II, right? That's where colonization was taken up, because it was coming on the heels of the Ottoman Turks and the Germans losing their territories as mandate territories. These weren't colonies, but they broke up the Ottoman Empire. So what we know today as, Lebanon. Lebanon used to be a part of the Ottoman Empire. Well, they lost that territory under the treaty that ended World War I, and it became a mandate territory under the administration of France, which mandated Lebanon to become an independent state. Colonization, the issue of colonization by the victors of World War II was taken up after World War II, right? And that's where you get into issues of trust territories, colonial possessions, non-self-governing territories, Article 73E of the UN Charter. All of that applies to non-state territory that have been colonized and that have a right to be decolonized. Much of Africa acquired its independence, these countries, through decolonization, but also in the Pacific. Indonesia acquired their independence. It used to be an Indonesian colony, right? The French in Vietnam, right? They're fighting for it, but eventually became independent. So this was worldwide. It wasn't just European. But again, the terms are important in order for us to understand, so that's why this was said, and then this was done. That's really all it is.
Thank you. Yeah, my background is in theology, so it's helpful to hear from like a law perspective how things like really matter in the language.
Sure.
This is a question from the chat, and let me just pause here and say I think we've agreed to go over maybe about 10 minutes. So mahalo, Dr. Sai, for being generous with your time with us tonight. We'll end around 5:10. So this is a question. It says, what are your thoughts regarding Hawaiian citizen repatriation? Would repatriation be required before government recognition?
Well, there's been a movement that I've come to be made aware of where repatriation is reclaiming your citizenship in the Hawaiian Kingdom. And if you're going to reclaim your citizenship under the kingdom, then you have to rescind your citizenship of the United States. Well, the issue of nationality is not one of choice, but one of process, right? So what that means is you are a Hawaiian subject, which is the citizenry of the Hawaiian Kingdom because of the laws of the Hawaiian Kingdom, not whether or not you accept it or not, right? If you accept it or not, and the country itself has a means by which you can rescind your citizenship, where you have to sign papers. It's a formal process. The United States actually has a process for that to get rid of your American citizenship, but you just can't declare it, right? Now, the point about Hawaii and the Hawaiian Kingdom, for people, they need to understand nationality and how nationality is acquired and how nationality can be rescinded. So in the Hawaiian Kingdom, the ways of acquiring citizenship is you can be born on Hawaiian territory, natural born. You can be born abroad of Hawaiian subject parents in another country. So you acquire citizenship by parentage, which is called jus sanguinis. You can get naturalized. That's when you apply for naturalization. I believe there was a 10-year residency requirement under Hawaiian Kingdom law, very similar to the United States, okay? That's why a lot of the citizenry in the Hawaiian Kingdom was multi-ethnic, but it also included those that actually gave up their citizenship, previous citizenship, and acquired Hawaiian citizenship. Many of the original missionaries gave up American citizenship. They actually became Hawaiian subjects. So that's a good indicator that they weren't trying to make Hawaii a part of the United States when they gave up their citizenship, right? So under the law of occupation, citizenry is affected this way. The law of occupation, its purpose is to preserve the status quo of the occupied state, its citizenry, its territory, its governmental institutions, right? So what that means is, under Hawaiian law, you could acquire citizenship by birth on the soil, but international law prevents that because of the occupier, right? So international law prevents acquisition of citizenry from the occupied state by birth. This was also taken up by the Israeli Supreme Court with regard to Israelis being born in Palestinian territory in the settlements. And they said, no, you have not acquired Palestinian citizenship. You only acquired Israeli citizenship by parentage in foreign territory. International law also prevents naturalization, obviously because the government is overthrown and it is controlled by an occupier. So you can't naturalize in any occupied state, in this case, the Hawaiian Kingdom. You can only acquire citizenship by parentage. So people today who are a direct descendant of Hawaiian subjects, irrespective of ethnicity, of Hawaiian subjects that were Hawaiian subjects previous to the overthrow on January 17, 1893, are Hawaiian subjects today. And that could be whether they were born abroad or born here. So for myself, under international law, okay, I'm not a Hawaiian subject because I was born here. I was born at Kapiolani Hospital. No, I was born of Hawaiian subject parents. So I acquired that. Now, my great-grandfather, well, he's from Sparta, Tennessee, Charles Reeves, right? He married my great-grandmother, Rose. So my grandfather, Henry Keanu Reeves, was Hawaiian by parentage and American by parentage. So he was a dual citizen, right? And then that was passed down to my mom and then down to me. Now, how you lose American citizenship, you have to apply. Or if you sign an oath of allegiance to another country to serve in their government, you lose automatically your American citizenship. Well, for me, when I traveled to the Netherlands, representing the Hawaiian Kingdom at the Permanent Court of Arbitration, I signed an oath of allegiance to the Hawaiian Kingdom. So I'm not an American. But that doesn't mean my mom is not an American. That's just me. So we need to understand the nationality question. But before we can answer that question, we need to understand what are the laws and how does it apply? Remember, this is not a political situation where I have a choice. No, you are who you are, but you have a choice to change. Not that you have a choice to choose. In the case of Hawaii, if you're a direct descendant of a Hawaiian subject, even if your great-grandfather was a trader called Lauren Thurston, right? Well, a crime is not inheritable, but the nationality is. So that person today is a Hawaiian subject. So we have to be careful how we refer to Hawaiians as well. Because you might look at someone and say, oh, you're not Hawaiian because he doesn't look native. He might be pure Chinese or Mandarin, should I say, because it's ethnic. That person might be Hawaiian. So a lot of this is what we do as far as research at the university. But the Hawaiian indigeneity movement is so focused on finding blame, blaming the missionaries, blaming Western concepts. It doesn't make sense anymore, right? It just doesn't make sense because it is not true. It has been falsified. But when we start to look at it for what it is, the benefits are there. The benefits in the Hawaiian Kingdom, universal healthcare, right? One thing I like to bring up is Joseph Navahi, as president of the Hawaiian Patriotic League, along with the other officers, John Cummins, honorary president, right? They referred to the insurgents as faithless sons of missionaries. Clearly, they were distinguishing between them and their grandparents or parents, right? So these little nuggets are there that can't be taken out of context, but it does help to explain and provide a better context to understand. Yeah.
All right, maybe we can do one more question and then we'll wrap up for today. Let's see here. Okay, within every individual communities within Hawaii, it is understood that Hawaii Pai'aina has been recognized externally as an independent state. However, when the Hawaiian Kingdom does not gain control over its subjects, how will our communities uphold our individual laws like CBSFAs? How will the Kingdom of Hawaii transition its subjects and communities?
Okay, so now we're going to get into what is the law of occupation, right? Because that's our situation. So when a country is occupied, it is an indication that its government was militarily overthrown. That's why it's called belligerent occupation. So if the government is overthrown, then it obviously does not have effective control over the territory that it used to have. So Queen Liliuokalani was the chief executive as an executive monarch whose job was to enforce the law, right? And she had a marshal, Charles Wilson, who, by the way, was Tahitian Haole. He wasn't Aboriginal Hawaiian, but he held the highest seat of law enforcement. His job with the police was to enforce the law. Well, after January 17, 1893, they could not enforce the law. They lost effective control. But that effective control under the law of occupation is what triggers the law of occupation, because a government that is imposed, or a military that is imposed in a foreign country who gains effective control is obligated to serve in the absence of that government to administer the laws of the occupied state. That's precisely what happened in the Spanish-American War. That's precisely what happened in Iraq War, right? They administered the laws of the occupied state. What we have today is the United States did not administer Hawaiian law, and they started a false narrative that Hawaii became a part of the United States, which eventually became the state of Hawaii. But I'll be covering this in a future talk that gets into why is it that we don't know this, and that is what we call denationalization. There's actually a policy of the territorial government called Americanization, where they took over all the public schools and private schools and taught the children, which is my grandparents' generation, to believe they're Americans, to speak English, okay, and only know American history. By the time that information got to my dad's generation, right, went to St. Louis, he was born in 1939, it's already institutionalized. He didn't know anything about the Hawaiian Kingdom. By the time it got to me at Kamehameha schools, I didn't know anything. You know, I know we got Hawaiian homes, right? That is the effects of denationalization. So that becomes the evidence of the crime. And denationalization is a war crime since 1919. Very serious issues. So we are dealing with a problem here where people don't know this information. And just as Dresden James said, the guy's a lunatic, right? Speaking the truth, he's a lunatic. We're dealing with that. And that's why, as you will see in future talks that I'll give, especially the final talk, the fourth one, we say, now what? It was a deliberate choice to go into the University of Hawaii and address this fabricated story from an academic standpoint, not political, right? Not legal, just academic research. And that, I can tell you, since the year 2001, has radically changed the discourse. Today, where it went from colonization to where now people are talking about occupation. We just got to keep continuing that type of education. And that's why I appreciate the people here, you folks, for providing a forum to provide education. This is not to get people to believe something. Just here, this is what's going on. I would like to close with the relevancy of knowing your past. Okay, when I was in the Army, as an Army captain, field artillery, we looked at history from a strategic standpoint, from a tactical standpoint, where the practical value of history is that it's a film of the past, run through the projector of today onto the screen of tomorrow. That film never changes, but you have to update your projector to process that film. Learn from the mistakes, capitalize on successes. From an Army standpoint, we got a battle plan now. Now I know how you fight. I'm going to engage you. Like Sun Tzu, Art of War, said, know your enemy like the back of your hand, not necessarily to defeat, but to anticipate the moves so you're still fighting. Now, when we take that here, the only opposing force that we're dealing with is ignorance. How do we deal with ignorance? We're not going to kill anybody, right? I may kill a paradigm, calamai for that, but hey, it goes with it. And that goes to finally how future is seen in the Hawaiian language. So the word future in the Hawaiian language is kawa mahope. Va or manava is time. Mahope is a directional, backwards. Like imua or mamua is forward. Ihope, mahope is backwards. So when Hawaiians, in their definition of future, is kawa mahope, which is literally the time of the past, that means that past needs to be understood because it is in that past you have the mo'olelo, the stories, where you capitalize on successes, you learn from mistakes. And then you will have what is called ike, foresight. Now you see something you didn't see before. Now, what is my kuleana? What is my role, right? Israel Kamakavivole, his album, Facing Future. Many people may remember that, right? And you see Israel with his back facing you. And the title of his CD is Facing Future, Kawa Mahope. That is what he was doing. He was looking to the future by looking to the past. You don't live in the past. You know the past. And that past includes not just what happened in 1893, it also includes what happened a minute ago or 45 minutes ago when I started this presentation. That all becomes a part of our history. Yeah.
That's a beautiful insight. Thank you, Dr. Sai. Let me invite Linda on here to just close us out for today.
Thank you. And thank you, Cassie, for managing the questions for us. For those of you who don't know, Cassie is also a member of the Justice and Witness Missional team. Dr. Sai, thank you so much for your sharing today. I do want to let people know, if you look in the chat, look at for the green square with the star in it at 4:55, and there is a link there for an article by Dr. Sai called Setting the Record Straight on Hawaiian Indigeneity. So be sure and copy that link if you want to explore further what he was sharing with us. So again, thank you all for being with us. Thank you, Kahu Davis, for your prayer earlier today. And everyone be well, stay safe, and hopefully we'll see you again next week at 4 p.m. Mahalo. Aloha.
Aloha.